When Emily first stepped through the creaking front door of her grandmother's house, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The furniture was covered in yellowed sheets, and the wallpaper peeled in places, revealing patches of cracked plaster beneath. She'd never met her grandmother. Her parents had always avoided speaking of her, but the inheritance had come as a shock. The lawyer's letter described it as a family heirloom. But the way the townsfolk had stared at her when she arrived made her uneasy. Their whispers trailed behind her like shadows, disappearing the moment she turned to look. The first night Emily slept fitfully, her dreams filled with fragmented visions of a woman in a faded blue dress. She woke to the sound of faint crying, so soft she mistook it for the wind at first. But it was coming from the basement. The next morning, she asked the grocery clerk about the house, but the woman's smile vanished instantly. Best not to ask, she muttered, handing Emily her change without meeting her eyes. At the local diner, the same thing happened. People turned away, changing the subject when she mentioned her grandmother's name. That night, the crying grew louder. Emily descended the basement stairs, her flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. The air was colder down there, her breath visible in the dim beam. The crying stopped when she reached the bottom, replaced by an unsettling silence. Then, just as she turned to leave, it started again. This time closer, almost as if someone were standing right behind her, sobbing into her ear. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Upstairs, she found an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, she stopped at a black and white image of her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside another girl with wide, frightened eyes. A girl the caption simply called a Lily. The crying echoed up the stairs again, and Emily knew, with a creeping certainty, that whatever was in this house had been waiting for her. And it wasn't done yet. The crying had started as a distant, haunting echo, barely audible beneath the creaks and groans of the old house. But now it was louder. Broken, rhythmic sob that seemed to seep through the floorboards. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her tea growing cold as she strained to listen. The sound wasn't just coming from the basement anymore, it slithered through the walls, wrapping around her like icy fingers. Then came the whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, whistling through the cracks in the aged siding. But the words were too deliberate, too human. Hushed voices murmured just beyond the plaster, sentences fragmenting into nonsense then reforming into something that made her skin prickle. "Find the door," Top's one voice hissed. "She's listening." Another replied. Emily pressed her ear to the wall, heart hammering. The voices fell silent. A cold breath brushed the back of her neck, and she whirled around, but the room was empty. The next morning, she ran into Mr. Thompson while collecting the mail. The elderly man had been kind but distant since she moved in, always watching the house with wary eyes. Today, he didn't bother hiding his discomfort. "You should leave that place," he said, gripping his cane tightly. "No good comes from living there." Emily forced a laugh. "It's just an old house. The wind makes strange noises, that's all." Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. Wen doesn't cry. Wen doesn't whisper names. He turned away before she could ask what he meant, leaving her standing there, the mail forgotten in her hands. That night, the whispers returned louder. They called to her, not in fear, not in anger, but with a terrible, knowing urgency. Emily. And for the first time, she wondered if the house wasn't just haunted, but hungry. The basement air was thick with dampness and the scent of aged wood as Emily descended the creaking steps, her flashlight casting shaky beams across the shadowed walls. The crying had grown louder, a desperate, muffled sobbing that seemed to seep through the very foundation of the house. Her grandmother's journal, found tucked away in a dusty drawer upstairs, had mentioned the basement, but the pages were torn and smudged, the words barely legible. Yet one phrase stood out: "A Lily is still here." At the far end of the basement, half hidden behind stacks of rotting crates, Emily spotted the door. It was unlike the others, narrow, with iron hinges and covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. The crying was unmistakably coming from behind it, a pleading, broken sound that sent chills down her spine. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the lock, but it wouldn't budge. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly under her touch, as if reacting to her presence. She stepped back, unease coiling in her stomach. The journal had hinted at something terrible, a secret her grandmother had buried long ago. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the fragile pages again, finding another passage. The door must never be opened. The cost was too high. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the basement, though there were no windows, no possible source. The crying sharpened into a wail, and for a moment, Emily thought she heard a whisper, "Please, let me out." Heart pounding, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Whatever lay behind that door was tied to her family, to Lily. And she had to find a way in. The basement was colder than usual, the air thick with a damp, musty smell that clung to Emily's clothes as she descended the creaking stairs. The crying had grown louder, more desperate, and it pulled her forward like a siren's call. Her flashlight beam trembled in her hand, casting shaky shadows across the stone walls. The locked door loomed ahead, its symbols faintly glowing under the flickering light. Or was it her imagination playing tricks? She reached out, her fingertips brushing the cold metal of the handle, when a movement caught her eye. A shadow, darker than the rest, slithered along the far wall. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it had shape, form. A tall, hunched figure, its edges blurring like smoke. Emily's breath hitched as it turned its head, though she couldn't make out any features, just a void where a face should be. Her heart hammered in her chest. She fumbled for the light switch, her sweaty fingers slipping before finally flipping it. The bare bulb overhead buzzed to life, flooding the basement with harsh yellow light. The shadow was gone, but the crying, now a wail, rose to a deafening pitch, and beneath it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the other side of the door. Emily stumbled back, her legs weak. The footsteps stopped. Then a scratching began, like long nails dragging down the wood. A whisper, too low to decipher, slithered through the cracks. The crying voice suddenly sharpened into a single word: run. She didn't need to be told twice. As she fled up the stairs, the lights flickered, and for a heartbeat she saw it again. The shadow figure, standing at the bottom watching her go. The crying from the basement had become unbearable, a constant wail that seeped into Emily's bones. But now, it was no longer just sound. It was movement. Objects in the house shifted when she wasn't looking. A coffee cup slid across the table untouched. A photograph of her grandmother, once neatly framed, now lay face down on the floor, the glass cracked like a spiderweb. Emily chalked it up to the old house settling, to draft she couldn't trace. But then she felt it, a cold, feather, light touch on the back of her neck, as if icy fingers had grazed her skin. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. The whispers in the walls grew clearer, no longer indecipherable murmurs but words, desperate and pleading. Help me, the voice sobbed, ragged and broken. Please, Emily, help me. It was the first time the voice had used her name. That night, as Emily lay in bed, the room plunged into unnatural darkness. The voice came again. Closer, as if standing right beside her. My name is Lily, it whispered. Your grandmother, she was my sister. They took me. They locked me away. Emily's breath caught. Her grandmother had never mentioned a sister. The journal she'd found in the attic, filled with frantic, rambling entries, had hinted at something terrible, but this was confirmation. Lily wasn't just a ghost, she was family. And she was trapped. The unseen hand returned, this time gripping Emily's wrist in a vice-like hold. She screamed, yanking free, and the room temperature plummeted. Frost spiderwebbed across the mirror, and in its reflection, for just a second, Emily saw a gaunt, pale face staring back at her, mouth open in a silent scream. Lily's voice was a broken echo. He's coming. The shadow watcher, he feeds on us. Don't let him take you too. Emily knew then. She wasn't just living in a haunted house. She was living in a tomb. And if she didn't act fast, she'd be joining Lily in the dark. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the brittle pages of her grandmother's journal. The entries grew frantic, the ink smudged as if by tears. The words described a ritual, one that required a sacrificial offering to appease an ancient force known only as the Shadow Watcher. Her stomach twisted as she read the final entries. I had no choice. Lily's blood was the price. The Watcher demanded it, or it would have taken us all. The truth crashed over her. Lily wasn't just lost, she was murdered. The crying in the basement wasn't a ghostly echo, it was Lily's trapped spirit, bound to the house by the very ritual meant to save the family. The symbols on the locked door weren't locks, they were wards, keeping Lily's tormented soul from escaping, and the Shadow Watcher from fully manifesting. Emily's breath grew shallow as she pieced together the horrors, the whispers in the walls. The Shadow Watcher, whispering to its prisoners. The shadow figure, a sliver of its presence, testing her fear. The unseen hand, its hunger growing stronger. Every creak of the house, every distant sob, was a reminder that the entity fed on terror, and she was its next meal. The journal mentioned a way to break the binding, but the ritual had never been completed. The Shadow Watcher had grown stronger over decades, feeding on the fear of those who dared enter the house. Emily's skin prickled. If she failed, she'd become its next victim, just like Lily. The cries from the basement grew louder, pleading, desperate. There was no turning back now, the ritual had to be undone. The basement was frigid, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, something rotten. Emily knelt in the center of the room, her grandmother's journal open beside her, the pages illuminated by the flickering light of a dozen candles. The symbols she'd painstakingly drawn in salt and chalk shimmered faintly, forming a protective circle around her. Her hands trembled as she recited the incantation from the journal, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger as the air around her grew heavier, pressing in like a suffocating blanket. The crying, Lily's crying, had stopped. Instead there was silence, a silence so profound it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the walls, and the candles flickered violently, their flames stretching impossibly tall before nearly snuffing out. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the temperature plummeted, her breath forming frosty clouds in front of her. The shadowy figure she'd glimpsed before materialized at the edge of the circle, its form shifting and wreathing like smoke. The shadow watcher, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and a voice, neither male nor female but somehow both, hissed from the darkness. "You should not have come." Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue the ritual, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. As she spoke the final words, the ground beneath her trembled, and a cold wind tore through the basement, scattering the salt and extinguishing the candles. For a heartbeat the darkness swallowed everything. Then, a soft glow filled the room, a spectral figure, pale and translucent, standing between Emily and the shadow watcher. Lily. Her face was gentle, her expression one of sorrow and resolve. She reached out, her ghostly fingers brushing against the entity, and with a sound like shattering glass, the shadow watcher let out a final, ear-splitting shriek before dissolving into nothingness. The house fell eerily silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the candles relit themselves, their flames steady once more. Lily turned to Emily, her lips curving into a sad smile before she too faded into the ether. Emily collapsed onto the floor, exhaustion and relief crashing over her in equal measure. It was over. And yet, as she gazed around the now quiet basement, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. The journal had mentioned the shadow watcher's hunger, its endless need for fear. Had she truly banished it, or had she only weakened it? The house creaked ominously, as if in answer, and Emily knew, deep down, that some darkness is never truly left.